interesting one. Thank you also for the local architects and researchers and historians that accept to be here. So I will start moderating this kind of discussion where we are expecting to get some feedback from the audience. So in the first moment, we will just question the three guests and then we wait for some feedback from this side. So I would like to start with Tarek. Mainly because there were many images there that relate to pace. So I think it can be the right way to start, because mainly before we talk about preservation, we need to talk about the buildings themselves. And on this sense, as I said to you before, I think pace has here some kind of, I would not say social responsibility, but there is a responsibility towards this patrimonium, because pace is responsible for erecting these buildings, and these buildings are also important, I think, for the learning process of the office. Everything, even everything that Michael was telling us about what means a corporate office, it's something that pace was being shaped through that process, I imagine. So I would like just to ask you two questions. One is what these buildings mean for pace today, because I don't want to take it in a historical perspective of the company. I want to know if this means anything for the company. And on the other hand, how are you willing to help for the preservation of these buildings in the years coming? So you have a micro there. So there is one micro per table, and it works. It's the logistics we got.
No problem.
And this micro is for any interaction on that side.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers as well, first of all. Thank you, Ricardo, for organizing this great get-together. I think the relationship between TAC and PACE started in the early 70s with partners at TAC and PACE, and some of the invitations that came through at the time for some of those buildings. It's before my time, so I don't know the complete details, but I'll try and enlighten you as to what they mean to us today. Especially, I think, for the Kuwait Fund building, I think it was you that mentioned, is it an architecture that we love as a company, and the way that it still is almost hasn't been changed in that last 30 years. It's now going under the process of certain renovations, but the space itself, the way that the office layout is working, and the access and the identity of this building, I think, for us is quite important. It says a lot about our own skills at the time for supervision and working drawings, etc. But I think, from an architectural point of view, it's also quite iconic in Kuwait to maybe my generation. I don't know about younger architects for that. Some of the other buildings, maybe where I don't know where, or me personally, I like the one which is Souq al-Watia, and then Souq al-Manakh, perhaps not so much, and maybe that's because I got to visit it at a later stage in its rundown state, and it's not, I think, fully used in a proper way. How we learned, and through our relationship with TAC and offices like SOM as well, I think there was a lot of learning between the two offices. Them learning perhaps a little bit about our culture and the way we live, etc. But more importantly for us, the way to organize our work in terms of the production and detailing, and understanding how to put buildings together in a very good way. And so that's what we learned from them, and their consistent sort of interfaces together. I spent some time in there before 1995, and so there was a lot of coming and going between the two offices, and that still happens today with other offices we may work with. So that's that.
Thank you. No, I don't know. You can say that you don't want to answer. My last question is about how PACE would be willing to get involved in the future of those buildings, Because if they have all that meaning they have for your experience today as an architect, like, are you willing to fight for these buildings? Are you willing to find solutions within all the institutional, political, even economical stage?
Yes, but we can't do it on our own. We need help.
Yes. I think we are here all to help.
Yes.
But you have a big stake on it, as I said before. Okay, thank you. I will now ask to Jabir. Thank you to be here. You were talking before about this idea of landmark, dispersion, kind of a noise. You told that all these buildings are sort of competing between themselves and very disturbing. So how do you see the issue of preservation more as a urban condition rather than building by building? Because it seems that from your speech you are more motivated with that idea of the image of the city. So what do you think about that?
First, I would like to thank everybody and the organizer of this presentation. If we go to the past history, as everybody present, we see we have variety of buildings, difference from class A to class F. It depends, because Kuwait, after the oil, unfortunately, all the architects came from outside, not from Kuwait. So there were no Kuwaiti architects. Everybody, they are import their experience from the colleges, from different the world, and they implement it here. We see that from before, from residents, from offices, mostly were Egyptian style, which, revenge of the past. They did, new modern architecture with different spaces, and with that, but I think they respect the climate, and they're using mashrabiyas, they're using the orientation very well. But in terms of spaces inside, it depends on the buildings. We have some nice buildings as a landmark. Does not mean a good building or bad building. But we know, like Fahd al-Salim, Fayan Ghanem, this corner, it was the high-rise building there. Considered. Everybody knows this is Kuwait. There are certain buildings, from the picture, we knew Kuwait. For that, most of these buildings are owned by private sectors. And government, of course, they did this private offices, government offices like Kuwait Fund. These are, I consider, the best building, like the Kuwait Fund. In that time, is number one, okay? And designed very well according to the climate, according to the requirement and the functions, and using materials, I think, well done. This we should keep it. And the government, they can, do that. But in private sector, if you tell somebody, okay, you have to preserve the building as a landmark, because the value of the land is very expensive now. So they want to utilize the spaces, the zoning different now. So he preferred to demolish and make high-rises, and he get money. If the government or they want to preserve this building, they should give compensation, or they buy the land from the private sector. Because mostly our buildings, we have it, the old is owned by public. It's very hard to preserve it as financially. So we have as government, we have to buildings we have to keep, like the parkings, car parkings did, and the Souq al-Manakh. I think they should preserve it, because this is history. It's not just architecture. Okay, the shock of the economical in Kuwait, you go, still now you go, it's like very calm building. During the Manakh, I was there. Functions, activities, talkings, nothing, just sitting people, no activities going, buying, but by words, all the rich people or some employee, they used to do some business, they come. So it's a gathering business place. And all traffic-wise, even at night. At night, 10 o'clock, they sell by telephone, and the price you said raised, yes, it is 16 million KD, a room in one office, 4 by 6, because the value of money was very expanded, For that, I think this building can be preserved by government. Thank you.
I think you touch there in two topics that I think are very strong for this discussion. One is how do you qualify buildings that are worthy to be preserved? And we talked about buildings that make the image of the city unique, like the Al Ghanim office building on the Jara Gate. You told us about buildings that, by their architectural and constructive solution, they are worthy to be preserved because they are buildings that interpret the local site conditions, as the Arab Fund. And you told us about buildings where history of Kuwait has been done, has been passed through. And I think these three, I think everybody agrees that those are 3 parameters. One thing that for me is key is how do you provide research, how you build all the information, all the legitimacy that can evaluate those 3 parameters in every building in this town. That's one question. The second question is when you talk about private sector, and this is a question I just remember because when you're talking about private and when here people talk about DEST, I always remember Wafra. Because Wafra Real Estate or others, private, public ventures, are bidding on empty plots. Why they are not bidding on buildings that are built already? And I think I would like to have also an answer for that, because it's worthy to launch a BOT on an empty plot. And why you can't do it on a built building?
Yeah, I think as the first question should be evaluating the existing buildings, okay? We should have some criteria, why we need to keep this building or to observe it, in terms of history, in terms of architecture, in terms of function, in terms of some usage, like we have a building in Kuwait when Al-Manakh collapsed, that building, all the exchange of the checks, maqasa, they call it. Now everybody knows building, maqasa building. They changed this name twice, but still, because it's a landmark. So some committee, okay, they should study these criteria and to make categorizations to see. Then some of them in the private, some of them in the public. If private, the government has to initiate to buy this land or buildings and make it as history. This is as for evaluation. The second, and the second thing, in Kuwait, I think we have like Macintosh chocolate, okay, or salad or punch, mixed from varieties of architectures. There's no coherent, there's no relation. Everybody's own style, because who decide? The owner. The owner, he select an architect, and before in 1960, 70, certain offices some of them they have a nice approach, and some offices have very standard. Still now, if you see Kuwait, this Kuwait city, some of very nice building design, outstanding design. And some of them is very unsuccessfully, unfortunately, I say it, because the owner does not appreciate the architecture. We have in Kuwait the problem, the architects like a draftsman. I remember when I graduated, my uncle, he said, come, I show you how to draft. I said, I'm not an architect. He said, he's a vernacular architect. He designed things. I said, I'm an architect, I'm not a draftsman. So we need public awareness, respect for architects. The client, he says, I am the owner, I have the money, you should obey me. We have the now, this is a government project, the airport, parliament. They came to the undersecretary, he asked them, this is our, we want to change the design. He said, you cannot change, this is my design. He said, no, I'm the owner, I'm paying you the money. He said, okay, take my name from the design. They think you are employee for the client. The architect is not employee. He assists the client to help him to reach his demand or his idea. Okay, we need some awareness in order to have nice building. Before, they don't respect landscape. Landscape is very, left over. In the end, you have money, you make landscape. Now, the owner become understanding of landscape is part of the design of the building.
Thank you. You touch a very interesting topic that will be the topic of tomorrow. So I invite you to be present tomorrow, because the topic tomorrow is to discuss about what's architecture, what are architects in Kuwait, and how they will guide their practice. I would like, before we go to Anas, just because Tarek wanted to say something.
No, you're talking about the heritage, what to keep, what not to keep. I mean, I'd ask this of everybody, but what to keep, for me, some of the buildings are because of creating a sense of place for me, that this is my country or whatever. Maybe the building itself is not of true value architecturally. Maybe it's related to the scale of this building. For example, the Al Ghanim building that you like, if we go down Fahd Salim, the battle of zoning that was created 5 years ago has ruined any, for me anyway, any historical value of sense of place. Perhaps it's not about the preservation of the building, it's about preservation of certain ethics or rules regarding scale of buildings and zoning in certain areas, which were totally obliterated and created this mishmash, Macintosh, not just the architectural facades or what have you. And then the other, that's sort of one criteria. And in terms of the public-private partnership issue, this is also sort of a gridlock of politics between private sector and public sector. And I think the private sector, a lot of developers that I work with do have fantastic ideas and are really willing to give back to the country, okay, at the price sometimes. They do want to make money, they are private developers, but there is a gridlock wall when they want to approach and negotiate give back criteria from public space to private space and vice versa. It's impossible. And when I saw one of your presentations, I think it was in Portugal, where you had public participation of 400 million euros with a private. This would be really difficult to put together here, and I know the BOT and PTB are trying to put these things together, but the process is impossible, and it's mainly for large infrastructure projects and not for architecture. So this is a huge challenge for us.
You just put out a very, for me, one of the strongest discussions. It's about this idea of space. It's a modernist idea, and this idea of place that is more a post-modern, could be, in a way. But it's a difficult field, and that's the reason I'm passing it to Anas, because I think that's where he is.
Well, I don't know where to start, but I had a couple questions. But,
Come sit here.
Thank you. Just to go, before I go away from this conversation, I think you raised an important point when you said it was about Kuwait Fund. At the time, it was good climatically, functionally, and everything. And that's one idea I was thinking about. If it was good at the time, what about today? Could you still keep it because it was good at the time? And the sense of nostalgia of this place, of a sense of place, and if everyone, I'm just trying to reach more of an objective rather than subjective idea of what is a place to preserve or an architecture to preserve. I have general questions slightly away from this concept of preservation. I don't know if I may switch to a little bit of, not a very far away topic, but actually your presentation. And I was wondering, when did TAC switch or transform from being Bauhaus to being corporate? I know like some recent scholars like Mina Mehta showed a couple of articles and she was saying that most of the buildings at the University of Baghdad is actually more Bauhausian than it was TAC, or it was like corporate. Oh, too far away?
Can I just interfere here? I think you can do that questions to Kubu after, to Michael. Because this is a very specific thing. And I think this audience is more willing to discuss what these two men were here talking about than to go into like TAC.
Very specific.
Very specific.
I mean, I'm happy to.
Sorry that I think
No,
we will have
I was trying to
chill
follow
out. We will have a chill out after.
Sure.
And you have more than time.
Maybe I can. I mean, I would be interested to respond to some of the comments. So maybe not that one specifically, but I don't know if I should talk into this thing. But it's one of the issues that you brought up that I think is very interesting is the building as a site of history, right? Which was a theme in my talk a little bit. And partly I would like to stress the role of the building itself in the construction of that history and in the provocation of that history, let's say. And so there's a very particular reason that I think the Souk al-Manakh is so interesting as a typology, as a particular sort of type. I can easily imagine that if a parking garage had been built on that site, but without the souk on the lower level, it might easily not have provoked a similar use and it might not have played a similar role in the construction of this, or as the site of this stock exchange. If it had been a souk, but without the parking on top of it, or without the offices of the Kuwait Investment Company on the top floor, it might not have provided the kind of critical mass that would have generated the population of traders, etc. And so it's the particular of this type that may or may not have had a specific role in actually producing some of that history. That, in other words, to think about the value of a building as residing in the history that took place there, I think what kind of building matters, right? It's not just any building, the way that it's constructed, the organization of it, the programs that occupy it. And so that, it brings me to another issue which has been raised, which is the question of the local and the global. And I think a lot of that question of what does one count as local, what does one count as global, how does one make that distinction as a kind of criteria, is often resolved simply by the name of the architect, right? So TAC is a US office, therefore it's a foreign building, right? And I wonder if it's possible to complicate the question of what counts as local and what counts as global as a more interesting kind of criteria, that it's not clear to me. It's very interesting in these buildings, for example, the materiality of the concrete, that this kind of aggregate, sort of hammered concrete that was new, and it was between TAC and PACE. PACE played a very heavy role in the building up the expertise, but this concrete was also produced. You have to import all the materials, as far as I can tell. It's a particular labor population that builds it, that constructs it materially, and so it's unclear to me on the level of the material. Do you count that material, the knowledge to produce it, the techniques of it, how you detail it, the material of which, the matter of which it's composed, do you count that as a local material or a global material? And then the kinds of buildings that are built out of it, typologically, right? I think of the souk, that's not actually a souk, but it's a parking garage, that's this kind of sandwich. I think of that as somebody from outside as a very Kuwaiti typology. I haven't found it in another place, right? So it's built by a foreign architect, but in collaboration with certain local modes of expertise. It seems to me a very complicated relationship, how you constitute a definition of local and global. And so I think these kinds of buildings, it might constitute some form of criteria about buildings where you can situate them at exactly the intersection of these things, that it gives a certain criteria for judging what is seen to be the value of them as object lessons for us today. Well, because it came up in the discussion. It was framed as, at least a statement was made that, and I think in what I've read of the literature about the urban history of Kuwait, there are at certain points a kind of blanket statement about the unfortunate appearance of foreign architects, right? As if it were kind of simple to segregate the issue of foreign or international architects coming in as seen as either good or bad, but that there's a kind of binary distinction between what corresponds to the local and the global. And so that's partly my interest in these buildings, is that I think any real attentiveness to the physicality of these buildings, the urbanistic siting of them, how they come to be in precisely the way that they are, complicates all of these issues in a way that I find very interesting. So my project would be to just undo the binary opposition rather than...
Michael, sorry.
Yeah.
You are just bringing a topic that close to the material. You need to have something that Jabbar Abulhassan was talking and that Nasser is obsessed. I think that it's the issue of the program in size. Because I think what makes it a Kuwaiti building, beyond the materiality or together with it, is this idea that you were stressing on Wafer Living presentation, the idea of the right dimension, what's the right dimension of these rooms, what's the right dimension of this building, and the idea of the program, like private, public, C, not C, all this type.
Yeah, I just don't know of another, I haven't seen that kind of program that is this promiscuous sandwich of parking as a public infrastructure, but also a souk in some ways the traditional sense of a souk, but also offices, etc., all kind of mixed in that way. I think of it as a very local thing.
About the mixed use, I think before the zoning or no codes in Kuwait, our house, old house, it was commercial with the residents. The first house in Kuwait has both, because we have of different levels of the street. So my uncle, he was the vernacular architect, he utilized this, instead to just dump the area, he utilized it as shops. So now mixed use you can do, and this is manakh for that, to have, because this is the company has to build car park from his expense. Okay, how he want to get the money? They give him the offices and the shops in order to get the refund, the money. This is economical decisions. So the mixed use, I think this is a good way for the private sector.
Perhaps I would go to Nasser about this issue of the dimension and size, because I think this is really something, because topic says space, place, materials, they are being stressed on the history of architecture globally and locally. This issue of dimension and size, I'm not seeing it often. And these people here are, since 50 years ago, designing houses with a very specific dimension, in rooms with a very specific dimension. And no one is asking why, or no one is exactly measuring it. And I think that's...
No, it's actually, this discourse is quite interesting, because we keep tackling the same problem, whether it's in a workplace or a residence or even a mosque. The clients seem to dictate to you the Listo program, which we keep calling the laundry list actually, and then they keep dictating also the dimension. So in a government building that we're doing, which is a competition, they keep telling you that the office should be 80 square meters. Why? No one knows. What goes in the 80 square meter? Again, no one knows. And if you start actually challenging them, why is it 80 square meters? They have no clue how even to furnish it, or even what goes in there, or what type of dialogue happens there. So we've done actually this exercise with some of the people here when we were teaching in Kuwait University. We started asking the students, can you define what you think local is? And we started challenging the students and trying to come up with what does traditional mean, or what does local mean, or what does Kuwaiti mean. And funny enough, at the end of the day, the conclusion that the studio had wasn't the Kuwaiti flag, and wasn't the beard, and wasn't the short dishdasha, and wasn't the veiled woman. It's actually, we're talking about traits that people have. So they were saying that generous, or they like to socialize, or we started at bringing up words that define what local is. And if you look at these words as architectural means of developing design, then I think we begin to talk about a real locality. So it's a locality that is beyond the space, locality that is beyond material. You actually start looking at how people live, how would they like to live, how they could like to sit next to each other, how to like to discuss. And this is why the topic of this Biennale was extremely perfect this year, and especially it actually was coupled with the Kuwait intervention there, because it did talk about common grounds. And the common ground is the relationship between people. And that comes from our obsession with the dimension, but not just dimension. It's actually with social interaction. No, I think they fall hand in hand. Architecture, at least to us, is just a background. And it should always be a background. It shouldn't be a foreground.
But you know that, for example, in European real estate, the architects are the responsible for the dimension of the buildings.
Definitely.
Because fees are measured by dimension. Definitely. And mainly this is a huge topic. It's been discussed a lot. Mainly now with the crisis in Iberic Peninsula, everybody is saying that the architects have a role on this because they were pumping it up.
Yeah. I have just because for some reason I feel like you're attaching locality with dimension. Is that something that can kind of, it was implied by like the comments before Nasser was saying, and I wonder if it's a larger size in Europe is considered a good thing or a bad thing.
No. Like basically, I can tell you that in the housing real estate, the fact of having a housing tower was many times defined by the architect, because we are talking about perhaps several areas of planning that were not defined at all, that gave a gap for the architects to teach promoters how to take it to the limit, how to build as much as possible. And for that, you need to build as more rooms as possible in your house. You need to define what will be the marketing patterns of the real estate market, and the architect is being a huge agent on this definition.
What I noticed about the size and what's more successful in the apartments that they're building for Wafra is, it's obviously direct correlation to the wealth of the country as well. I mean, 100 years ago, 80 years ago, we were living plus extended family, plus grandparents, plus cousins perhaps in 2 or 3 plots or even smaller of 500 square meters or less, much less. And now, you get larger sized rooms because of each individual requirements, air conditioning, etc., etc. It's also where is that coming from? That's due to the wealth of the country. In terms of the way that you're talking about the dimensions in relation to Europe, also we have, I think, a frivolous attitude to the materials, perhaps, and our use of energy. So all these things are still not in our psyche in order to, cut those things down, because we're not paying real prices for electricity, for example. We're not designing. So when our client comes to us, they're asking, even if they don't need that space, they just want this room. You know what I'm saying? Because of those 2 reasons as well.
I think this topic we are now on a point where we are already in Ketra. So I would like to invite some participation from the audience, mainly the ones that also were discussing about this topic during the last months. Because I saw, for example, Nasser talking about that the students qualified the locality and the culture of the rooms by the activities that were done in that rooms. So the room together, the room to do this, the room to do that. So we are talking now about a very, very common issue and topic that I think was very stressed in Ketra discussions.
Going back to the topic about the local or what to preserve and how to preserve it, I don't think the local or the global matters much as much as the amount of knowledge that the building can give us right now. It doesn't matter if it was built in the past or if it was, what era did it come from. I think we're preserving it for the future and for the future generations. They're not going to look at it as we do. It's going to be different. So I think the amount of knowledge should be the criteria that the building, that tells whether the building should be preserved or just demolished.
Thank you.
just a general question that I have in sense of scale, especially to the suburbs here in Kuwait and how we deal with designing our houses. I personally think I had this discussion with also a friend of mine, and I personally think that our idea of scale for the houses that we live in today is pretty much based on, I don't know, I mean, this is a question also based for you to have your input on it, is that our perception of scale is pretty much based on our older generation and how they perceived space, where they had, of course, these courtyards, the amount of light that flooded into the house, and also the extensive use of, and that, of course, has been translated to the scale and design of our houses with these extra rooms that are, at the end of the day, not in use, and also the extensive use of lighting. If you realize, I mean, as all of us here live in these concrete palaces, as I usually call them, we usually have this extensive amount of light. And my father, my mother, they come from a very older generation, and they always have to be in constant light. They don't like the whole very dimmed type of lighting and stuff like that. So I would like to see what your input in regards to that is.
Thank you. Any more questions before we go there?
My comment is also related to scale and specifically to the Wafra project by AGI. I think Jabriya is special, and if you agree, it's different from many suburban areas in Kuwait. And I think it's special in the sense of it's got a variety of uses. The only thing that Jabriya doesn't have is an airport, and I've heard that from many people. What do you think is the impact of that building? Where is it exactly located?
It's too far away from the Mubarak hospital.
Yeah. So I live in Jabriya, and I love living in Jabriya. A lot of people would be surprised. Yes, it's traffic-wise, it's congested, but I think there are many solutions to that. I think it's got the right recipe to have a prosperous town, prosperous neighborhood. But I wonder, is it going to end up with what makes it not ending up as another Sawabir?
I was thinking while your discussions are going on about housing distribution, and how in the time where oil was discovered, and in the 60s, and when it started to when we started to do projects, because we have wealth and kind of the establishment of the welfare state, wealth is kind of distributed to the public through housing projects, so through the housing urban projects and the new districts. And this means providing more space for each individual. In the same time, because of the welfare economy, there's kind of a sprawl of expats going in, migrating in Kuwait City, not just because of oil, it's also because of some conditions, like regional conditions that happen, like for example the Palestinians, and like different events happening at the time. And this made a kind of a paradox in the land distribution, because you have inflation in the amount of expats going in Kuwait, and the amount of spaces provided for them, versus Kuwaitis, which are kind of like 1/3 of the entire population, having more space and really like most of the spaces are actually for them, designed and give to them.
Thank you, Dina. So I think we had three very diverse, interesting points. So the building has a source of knowledge, and that addresses also the issue of what's the role of Kuwait University in this country. The other, the issue of the space itself, the obsession for the light, the need of building volume to cool the building, that I think it's a very interesting concept that was there on the former houses. And also the issue of some kind of space dimension welfare. So I would like to know who wants to talk.
Go where or? Oh yeah, I can use this one. So I was very interested in the comment about a criteria for deciding which buildings matter to us now in terms of what lessons they have to teach us for the future, right, rather than their architects, etc. And this is actually directed at Sara's work, which I would very much like to commend the importance of this work. And it's essentially the issue of the role of the archive and the importance of that. And the archive is tied up in a very deep way with these buildings and what they have to teach us. It's the buildings speak, but also other things speak for them. And if that knowledge is also lost, then it becomes even harder to make a case for some of these buildings. It's because we change, we don't always know what lessons a building will teach us in the future if we leave it long enough. It teaches us certain lessons in the present. It may or may not. We don't know how these things will or will not matter. And so the buildings themselves and the preservation question, the buildings themselves are, of course, an extremely important, maybe the most important archive. It's the physical archive of these things, the decisions that were made and are evident in the materiality in the construction of these buildings. But there are other kinds of archives. There's paper documentation. There's the historical documentation of these things. And if those things are lost and not built up as a kind of platform for us to continue to revisit the history of these buildings, it becomes that much harder. And so I would stress the one corresponds to the other. And so I take your project as building up an archive as a kind of future platform for us to learn things from these buildings, and to do it kind of in parallel with, the threat to the physical paper archive is sort of coincident in a lot of cases with the threat to the buildings themselves. And if the one doesn't exist, it becomes easier to demolish the other, and vice versa, right? And it's a very crucial issue. And I think the work that you're doing is very important in that sense.
Real quick thing. Oh, go ahead.
When we were talking about foreigner architects, I don't see them as foreigner architects. I see them as architects. Of course, that I put one of the most famous ones because it's important for people to pay attention. Because if I only put the other buildings, probably the audience doesn't stay so interesting. So because when the modern heritage for me is an international movement, it's not a local movement, and it's not only about architecture, but it's a way of stay of the human being. So if we put down all these buildings, we are erasing almost the 20th century. So, of course, many buildings will be down, and that's okay, but it's important, as you say, to take photos, to make an inventory of this kind of buildings, because we have an idea how is Egypt in the ancient times because of the books and because of some pictures and some drawings. So this is a long process to make, and I don't want to say, in Europe we preserve everything. It's not true. We have laws. If we didn't have laws, most of the buildings were down because they are also private. So, but for example, what is in this moment, what we do with the old buildings with that big walls is we demolish the interior we left the facade beautiful and nice, and we put luxury apartments inside. At this moment, they are the most exclusive apartments in the city center, and everyone wants to live there. So it's not the perfect solution, but it keeps a memory of the city. So there are lots of solutions.
Sorry, that goes to the facadism issue, that I think it's another strong issue, and you are willing to talk about.
Super short. I agree on, I support definitely the idea of the preserving the archives, but I also would like to give a note about the same comment about a building in itself as a medium, as a media that gives knowledge to the people. I really think that the archive is a set of material, is a treasure, but also the building itself is a source of knowledge. That's something I think we'll have to see too. If you want to be a singer, you can have that one.
I wanted to link two conversations that I feel are a little too distant right now because they're artificially separated. One is the idea of preservation, and which we've talked about, and the other is the idea of, let's say, a problem that maybe Kuwait has, maybe not, which is this unease about housing or the typology of housing. I think those two issues are related in a very significant way, and I think we need to maybe start to discuss them in a linked way. So when you brought up the issue of the Bauhaus versus the corporate, those are very artificial separations, and I think they're very problematic. The Bauhaus came out of a fusion of vernacular research and an interest in sort of contemporary construction techniques, and those two actually merged and were very significant and fruitful. And I think what's interesting about, again, Nasser's problem maybe, and the issue of preservation, those could really be linked as an issue. And in both cases, really what we're missing in the discussion is understanding use by people. So there's the archive, there's the building as an artifact, and then there's the kind of things that, again, Michael pointed out, that a group of Kuwaitis could identify a new building to serve both a traditional use of space and a new function. I mean, that to me is maybe the crux of what we should be studying. We shouldn't worry about lists of preservation. I'm being polemical here. We shouldn't maybe criticize or be uncomfortable with the issue of the 2,000 square meter house, because I think it's indicative of a new and old culture in Kuwait. We should probably look at why, for example, the Ericsson housing was a success, not a failure, but was a certain kind of result, and it continues to be a certain kind of result, and why the housing in the quote-unquote suburbs, which is pretty much the city, and which is also built very much on imported models, very interesting imported models, but also on the self-expression of Kuwaiti citizens. Those are, I think, the areas where research really needs to happen right now. And I think actually the understanding of preservation would be benefited by helping Nasser and understand, but also maybe questioning why tower living is good for Kuwaitis, and why, large 2,000 square meter houses are good, and why even the Ericsson attempt, which is probably the closest attempt at stacking houses in a vertical way that is different from an apartment building, was not received well at a certain time, why the parking garage was received as if it was a natural kind of social space at the same time. I think I'm just throwing that in here, but I think those two conversations are intricately linked. And what's missing here, though, is a methodology of accessing the rich data that you have around you and how that gets instrumentalized.
It's an important issue, because if you start actually looking at what a building like we're in, okay, how many of you has been in this building before? Okay, probably 10%. Okay, why is that? Because it's not so integrated within the urban fabric. And then we would say, where is the urban fabric? Which is missing. So we could actually renovate Al Manaf without knowing what to place in it, and then it will still be a monument that is preserved. But would it function any better? No one knows. So we should look at the same way TAC looked at a new prototype of office, car park, public plaza, or enclosed public plaza at that time. We should begin to address these problems. And we should begin to look at what is the definition of a new program. And I think the initiative right now is very difficult because Mr. Jabir was talking earlier that because of the laws and the regulations, it doesn't exist. A building cannot be multi-use. A building has to, like this building, if you want to put a retail outlet, they won't allow you because it's a historically preserved building. But they need the retail outlet to clean the building, right? The money from the retail outlet to maintain the building. But no one yet has reached that consensus because the welfare state is paying for cleaning the building, paying for running the electricity. And I think we're getting to a point where, to answer the question that was said earlier, the problem, I believe, in one of the many problems, but one of the problems that is the failure of Sawabir is that there wasn't an organization that owned that building, owned the public place. There was barely public space, but didn't own that public space, didn't own maintaining the facade, maintaining the elevators. So it degraded too fast, okay? Besides the other point, whether it was constructed correctly, if the orientation was correct, if they rotated the building, you hear those many stories, and I don't know how many of them are true or not true. The means of actually creating a proper organization or multiple organizations to run these buildings is something that we're missing. And I just to comment on a side note, you talked about Jabriya. I'm actually fascinated with Jabriya. I'm not sure if you're aware, we've been running a studio within our studio for the past year to try to densify Jabriya more than it is right now. And actually, we've taken certain blocks of Jabriya and actually residential blocks, even mid-rise and low-rise blocks. And we've looked at ways to double or triple even the number of occupancy because there is room. It's not yet done correctly because people are there, but they're not comfortable. So how do we allow them to be more comfortable? And I think Jabriya is a key actually neighborhood because you could walk, although the sidewalks are not properly done. Yeah, but they're not yet actually done correctly. You actually have all the mixed-use facilities within this big neighborhood, within this kilometer by kilometer neighborhood. So why can't we even start actually improving it and making it a model neighborhood versus what it is right now?
Sugar.
But each one is done by dosing. You have, if you want that dosing, you don't want the cake. So it all goes down to the roots of land use. So how much and where and when they
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge that was raised earlier, is this issue of program, and most importantly, it's actually the urban ramification of that program. So you don't just place a program like this building. It was preserved, but barely any of us have been here, and we call it a preserved building.
Who's to blame for that? Like, why don't we come here? I mean, can you? I'm questioning actually.
I'm not really a pessimist. I don't think anyone is to blame. I think we as architects have to start finding solutions for it to work.
I mean, it's really hard to do a similar event like this.
Sorry, Yanis. Like Tarek and Jabir.
I think Jabriya area was planned privately because in Kuwait we have government planned. They planned very well, and as private, they want, just utilize, maximize the plot area, and the street narrows. You see like Cordoba, Yarmouk. This is not Namudaji or government. Yeah. So we have the different in planning. You will see these are the problems.
I mean, I'm interested to ask you, Ricardo, about this program for preserved buildings. I mean, I kind of disagree. This building is in use. It is an office building. It's been preserved. And it does have a function. And a lot of the National Council must be credited for doing a lot of great renovation on some historic buildings, which are all currently used. But I think the conversation is beyond that. There's some other buildings when we decide what to preserve. What is the program that goes? Can we turn one of these 50s building into school again, or kindergarten, or make it part of the community? I think it's that step beyond what we already have. That's what I want to ask you.
I think for sure, because part of my relation with this building, the first time I came to this building, And the first time I started discussing about Venice Biennale, and the first time we talked about this conference was when I was here with Zara, talking with her chief, that I don't know if he's here or not. No, Zara is there, but her chief. And basically, it's interesting because they were talking about a building that the National Council bought just not to be destroyed, because it was public. It was not even a private building. We are talking about a public building, I think, right? Yeah, it's from the municipality. So the National Council bought it not to be destroyed. But then the only idea that came in mind was, how can we make a theater? This was an old souk. So, because there is a repertoire of typologies that I can put in buildings owned by the National Council. And I think this is a way of thinking that needs to be radically turned down and transformed. And of course, for that, you need to have the discussion in one side, the platform, questioning, makes sense to school, what program makes sense here. And on the other hand, we need also to build the knowledge and the resources that will allow us to make that decisions. But I think one very productive field for that type of findings is being the cooperation between public and private. At least from my knowledge in Europe, it's the most successful urban renovation. It's the cooperation between private and public, because basically the public keeps the commonwealth somehow, it's supposed to, and on the other hand, the private reflects the dynamic of economy, social needs, all that. So I think we have here a joint venture that can be working very well. And this discussion about how it's private, how it's, I think it's not at all an excuse, because as Sarah, for example, was saying, in Europe it happens exactly the same thing. Actually, I would say 99% of the buildings are owned by privates, the ones that are being renovated, and they are being like super dynamic agents of transformation and renovation of cities, from the higher hand to the lower hand. I'm talking from the expensive flats she was talking about to the kind of more informal and occasional occupation that's related to urban culture and artistic movements and all that types of things. So I think there is a lot for Kuwait to go into. I hope I respond to your question.
I think about that. To reuse a building, it's possible. It's possible. In Portugal, I have done some projects and for private clients, and of course they want to get money of the building. And most of them are very old, and but it's possible. But the people must be open-minded when they got into those buildings, because we cannot expect the same sensation in the new building and in the old building. I can put the same program, can be a theater, but will be a different theater. So we must be open to get these new typologies inside these buildings.
The rules should be changed. The rule codes, government, this is the responsibility of the government. If you have a building, you want to change the function, if the rule, they say you cannot. So you are not flexible. So it means the codes, and like now I'll give you we have houses, old houses, Bahbahani Watiya, old house. The government, they change it to restaurants. Okay, every house become, one of the house become offices and the other become like restaurant. But this is like not as a rule. They give you exception.
But it is preserved.
Preserved, yeah.
As retail.
Yes, yeah. This is as exceptions, not as a. You know, you cannot change your house to a restaurant. They don't allow, because that a complex of old houses. The government appreciate to preserving these houses. They allow them to change the function.
Jabir, but let me make you just respond to that. And I think that's opening the discussion of tomorrow. And I think we are getting late, so I want to do a last round. But the issue is, I go back now to my country again. So in 1948, we had the first meeting within architects. The country had no specific regulations concerning building codes. In 1952, 4 years later, was published the first building code. And there is a strong relation. We have 4 years where people get together and start working. And I think this is also what's missing here, because I'm seeing lots of knowledge that it's completely dispersed and it's not together. Where is the Society of Architects? Where is any kind of committee that represents architects of this country? And I think this needs to be challenged.
Okay, I just wanted to say one quick thing, which is that there's a bit of a romanticism about solving the recipe, finding the right rules, and I would just say that a lot of the things that we've seen in the presentations and in discussions about the way people live remind us that what really needs to be supported also is a kind of experimentation that allows you to test, because you don't really know, no one in any country really knows cities, understands cities, social issues are too complex. And I mean, all of the Kuwait city is a regulated experiment, whose results may not have been collected yet. And before those results are collected, making more rules will create, and it's been proven in a lot of places, bureaucracy and over-bureaucratization produces the opposite of order. It produces chaos, actually. It produces the white noise that you see in very overly planned cities sometimes. So I think the issue of, it's not just about sitting down and developing a set of rules, it's about really framing a process where you do research, but you also try things maybe in a very localized way. But you identify something that needs to be tested and the parameters. It's experiment.
But that's the importance of his experience shared with his experience, and all them for sure they have their experiments that were done here, and some of them have already the distance enough to understand how that experiments resulted or not. So I think all the knowledge is pumping out. It's just a question of putting it together. So I will go for a last round of questions in the audience.
It's really more of a comment here. I think basically all this great discussion that we were having, I think it can all fall under that we need to study more the human behavior in architecture, and how it's really a relationship of how human behavior in general can affect the way we design and what's required of our designs, and then in return the design that the product of this design, how it will in return affect the human behavior. So even I feel like this issue or this topic can sort of cover all of what we've discussed here today in terms of preservation of buildings. We'll see the buildings that are encouraging some positive, for example, human behavior, where these buildings definitely we should keep. Some buildings, although they might have historical value, if left abandoned, they will encourage some negative, probably negative behavior, which we might need to fix or find a solution for. Also in terms of space and designing, like, as we said, the houses here in Kuwait, probably we need to look into why Kuwaitis want, for example, a very big house with a large number of rooms, which we may or may not use. We tend to contradict ourselves in terms of what we need or what we want, and sort of the idea of what we would like to have. We see a lot of contradiction, for example, in houses where we like having the options of having the house to grow, for example. So in the future, my kids could have the upper floor, and then we can build another one on top and something. We'd like having this extra room where we might not use right now, but I like having the option, for example. We see these growing designs with very large windows facing the street, but in return, as human behavior, we're a very private culture. What's going on is we see these designs with huge windows that are always closed with shutters and curtains and stuff. So we need to study this human behavior to find out exactly what we need in terms of usage, rather than what we want or what we would like to have. What's successful for human behavior for other countries and other cultures might not be successful here, and vice versa. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yep. One last comment. Are you willing to give a last comment?
Just thought what you are saying is very interesting, and I also think it connects some issues that were said here, because in reality there exist always two cities. There is always the physical geography of the city and the psychological geography of the city, a psychogeography of a city. And also, in reality, that should be one of the criteria one should have in order to understand what we should maintain or not. We should and use qualitative techniques to understand which are the meaningful objects and which are the meaningful relations, because not always we talk about objects when we talk about the non-physical city that should be maintained and which are part of the cultural heritage we need. And I would say, just to like my final commentary, that what we face here is like the universal problem, which is we have the responsibility to give to those who came after us to maintain some of the heritage, but also at the same very time we have the responsibility to create the new heritage. And we should assume both of them, because future is also cultural heritage. And if you don't build it today, there will be none. There will be just what we have preserved. And that applies more for Europe, because we are preserving too much. That's our office position. But I think it's always about the balance between these two things. What we should preserve and what we have the responsibility to pass to others, and what we should create. That's also a responsibility we have to assume as architects, and we have to assume as citizens. And that's why I think it's also important what Ricardo said about architects should stay together and organize in order to promote the defense of these both heritages.
One last comment. I know this. Everybody's tired, but one more.
It's Ramadan.
But I totally agree. And I think that the issue of past and future, in the end, it's also a criteria for looking at a lot of buildings from the past, is that a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of these buildings were themselves projective. They were part of the interest, and what they have to teach us is that they were projecting particular futures, and sometimes when you remove or you are not attentive enough to something from the past, you close off potential futures that may or may not have been realized in particular ways. And so you can activate or unlock futures of things often by going back and looking at the past. And it's I think that attitude of kind of building the future into thinking about the present or the past, and vice versa, can also unlock certain ways of thinking past what I agree is a very static question of preservation. The discourse around preservation, as it has been understood, as a kind of binary, you either keep it as is, as a kind of dead monument or museum or something that's fixed at whatever historical moment one declares it is kind of done, or it's sort of open season, one can remove it. And I think, the question of how do you activate futures in these things also opens you up to the possibility of change in buildings, that often the way of preserving certain kinds of futures that were implicit or latent in buildings as they were built is by activating them, is by doing things that were not part of the original building or modifying them, right? So it's a much more continuous relationship. And so the question of projecting the future into the present, I think, also applies to the past.
Concerning that, and concerning the idea that this future image of Silk City, and this idea of defining a future that is comfortable, and it's under a series of definitions that I could say that are relying on the construction of an artificial universe that will give you the level of comfort you need. So do you think that the shaded surface that you have today in the city, that basically allows you to go from Souk Al-Wataniya to here without walking more than 5 minutes on the sun, is that reason more than enough to preserve these buildings? Because we have been talking always about the use, about the program, and then we were talking about psychological dimensions or even psychic dimensions. But in such a place where everybody, when they were defining the future, they were always trying to search for the most comfortable, and the most comfortable used architecture to provide an artificial environment, an artificial weather, an artificial climate. So Do you think it's worthy that?
Solely for that criteria. I mean, it's one of the factors in looking at these buildings, right? For sure. For sure. I mean, and it requires, as has been said, it's back to Ivan's point that what we consider to be an archive or a set of data on how to understand a building is much broader than we think. It encompasses use, it encompasses urban setting, it encompasses the ways in which it was intended to be used when it was built versus the ways it has been used over time and how those might change in the future, for example. And so if that, if that was intentional or not, that's a question. One doesn't know, but it certainly is a way that it functions now, and it's a part of the criteria of how.
And it's part of your analysis of what's today valid within that situation, because on the other side of the city has been built a mall that's basically is using the same concept but relying on AC.
Yeah, but it could also be, it could just as easily be, for example, one could imagine a set of buildings where you now, looking at these buildings, could project that particular use for it, but where that use does not actually quite happen in the way that one would want it to. And so you would have to do something to the original buildings in order to kind of create a future which might have been implicit in it, but is for you to realize in the present, etc. Right? So it's a very flexible mode of evaluating what a building means to us and how one can or cannot use it in the future.
Just one last comment, closing comment, is that I'm very impressed with how mediated the Kuwaiti society is. It's something that it's much more futuristic in that sense than societies that I'm familiar with. The comfort of different kinds of media, the kind of the television shows, the tweeting, and so on. And I would say that maybe that's another frontier for these two discussions, the preservation and the housing discussions. I've always been impressed at how really aesthetics are defined in these kinds of media, and that I think the production of myths is very important. The histories of this wild stock exchange could be a really interesting soap opera. The kind of lives of these mega houses and the futures. The comment that was very interesting to me, the idea that these mega houses will one day become even bigger and they'll become little cities, is a very interesting and provocative story. So I can tell you that from the history of modern architecture, without that component, without the dialogue of fantasy and narrative, none of the buildings that we associate with any kind of meaning from the history, we didn't talk about history that way, and from contemporary buildings, they wouldn't mean anything, actually, really. There is no essential meaning to these buildings. There is a lot of applied meaning, which is not to say that it's artificial. It's very real, and that's where culture actually comes from. So in addition to the disciplinary discussions that have to happen, unfortunately, those have to happen simultaneously as reaching out and going into what are realms that are maybe not comfortable always for architects and for planners, but without which preservation will never happen, and the kind of Kuwaiti housing lifestyle will never be questioned as either traditional or really, for me, is radically futuristic, the kind of large family home in a cul-de-sac, which didn't exist 50 years ago anywhere really in the world. So that kind of discussion, the Imaginarium, what Ricardo always talks about, is where also these problems can be creatively not just solved but raised.
Okay, thank you. I think everybody's super tired. There is something to eat in the next courtyard that it's not a courtyard now because it's covered. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed, and tomorrow